Good evening. I'm so happy that you accepted our invitation for this interview. It is a pleasure to have you here to discuss one of the biggest challenges of the 21st century regarding the modern paths to terrorist radicalization and what part does the West play in that. State failure in the Horn of Africa pushed Europe away from its comfort zone to become a security provider. There is an emerging need to do the same in West Africa. In Central Asia and the Caucasus, Russia and China plays that role. It is unclear where exactly is the United States situated in this evolving security landscape. As multipolarism undermines the role of the United States as the sole guarantor of a multilateral order, Washington apparently reevaluates relationships with allies with a more transactional rather than transformational ambition. Given that such transactional approaches gave rise to the Taliban regime, the question becomes whether American foreign policy has adjusted to an evolving security landscape. When it comes to counterterrorism policies, how important is it for security that the US and its allies share the same values? Dr. William Farrell holds a PhD from the University of Maine with a focus on political science and international affairs. He has worked in leadership positions in multilateral organizations and for the United States government for the past 25 years. Earlier in his career, Dr. Farrell was seconded by the US Department of State to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, where he was engaged in the formal peace process between Georgians and South Ossetians, as well as between Tajiks during the civil war in Tajikistan. He has conducted field research in large parts of the Sahel, Caucasus, and Central Asia for concrete ways in which development assistance can be used to counter violent extremist activity, build stability, and support national cohesion. Dr. Farrell is also a professor at the University of Maine for the School of Policy and International Affairs. Dr. Farrell, you have area studies experience in Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the Sahel, as we already mentioned. In your view, what are the conditions under which state failure becomes an international security liability?
Great. Hey, thanks, Karina, very much for the question. Here you're talking about spillover effects. And with globalization, we've already seen that our world's already becoming closer than it ever has been. So something happening in one place, obviously it has impacts in other places. Certainly we're all living that right now, right? The current pandemic is an example of the spread of problems. But let's focus on terrorism for the moment, since that's the topic of the day. At the heart of state failure is really the question, at least to my mind, of whether the social contract between the people and its leaders is still intact. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's really, is there social order and security in exchange for authority, right? So this is really, it's an issue of legitimacy of leadership. So, does the population, including minority groups specifically, I mean, maybe most importantly, do they feel that the state's holding up their end of the implicit deal? And is governance equitable? Is there law enforcement and rule of law? Do people have an opportunity to live and thrive? I mean, those kind of questions are part and parcel of state legitimacy, but we've seen, time and time again that where legitimacy of leadership is called into question due to, whether it's weakness or it's inattentiveness or maybe even it's willful punitive behavior, that there's this perceived lack of legitimacy that can give rise to contesting of power. Particularly, we see this particularly in those like isolated pockets, remote from capital cities, where the density of government administration is thin. We saw this in the 1990s in the Fergana Valley of Central Asia with the emergence of groups like Adolat, which later became the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. More recently, we see it in a place like northern Mali with Ansar Dine. In the Ansar Dine example, when we conducted research there in 2017, so up in Kidal region in the north of Mali. And this is after the jihadis had pulled back or been pushed out rather. Our research showed that when we asked normal people questions about governance or about the situation under the jihadis versus under the government of Mali, that, repeatedly we heard many people express that, the situation under the jihadis was harsh, but it was more transparent and predictable. And lawlessness, in fact, went down. So there's this alternate governance structure that people had an opportunity to compare with the government of Mali. And many of those respondents at the time, they were telling us that they felt this is real deprivation between what was happening in the north where they lived versus what was happening in the south. So we kept asking people questions about why they joined armed groups at the time, and the alternate governance model was a piece, right? A piece of that. What our state is failing, and we're looking for an alternate governance model. The second piece was related to the perception that they were going to get material benefit or some sort of financial benefit. And then the third, maybe most important piece was these kinship connections or acquaintance connections that people had this sense that they needed to protect their community, they needed to have honor and respect by being involved. So and meeting that responsibility, but that story aside on Ansar ad-Din, let me just say, in that struggle for power, again, to your question about threats to external countries, in the struggle for power, armed groups need manpower, then they need weapons, they need money, and they need a rear base. And some failing or failed states, they're unable to adequately control their borders, right? A sort of a base or requirement of running a functioning state. And there, in those places, there's porousness. So we see, this dynamic along the desert areas of the Sahel. We see it in the mountains of the Caucasus. We've seen it in the mountains of Central and South Asia. And here, as you might expect, you see drug and commodity smuggling routes, human trafficking, and movements of armed groups. So it's really this, answering your question, a transnational threat. I mean, look at Burkina Faso is a great example. Peaceful country, and then the spillover from Mali really deeply impacts them. Or Syria and Iraq, and the spillover of refugees into Jordan or Lebanon, really causing potential instability in those countries. And then, Afghanistan, that contested authority creates these spheres of influence between the government and the Taliban that allow other armed actors to really, play a role in those places. So, let me just put a finer point and to wrap up, so I'm not taking too much time in your question. State failure and deteriorated legitimacy, they absolutely 100% go hand in hand. And where there's a lack of monopoly on force and authority, well, there's oftentimes a contestation or contesting of struggle for power. And where states have an inability to control their border areas, we find illicit transnational activity emerging. So it's here that we see this real international security liability, like you're asking.
Thank you, Dr. Farrell. That was very interesting. And you are creating now the ground for my second question, which is about the 9/11 that happened here in the United States when the US declared war on the Taliban regime. 2 decades later, Afghanistan continues to face an acute problem of corruption. The conflict is still ongoing, and the dependency on foreign aid is as great as it has ever been. In the absence of rule of law, who is a terrorist?
Yeah, good question. Who is a terrorist indeed? I mean, really, you're asking an important one. I mean, if you look at the national government lists of terrorist organizations, what you find is that those lists are not homogenous worldwide. So, you have like Hizb ut-Tahrir is illegal in Central Asia, but it's legal in the United States. The Proud Boys, which we hear so much about on the news, have been declared an ideologically motivated violent extremist group in Canada, but not in any other country. So why? Well, because countries identify terrorists based off of threats to their own national interests, not threats to other countries' national interests. So you can have quite a large gulf between which groups are designated as terrorists and which are not. At the transnational level, of course, United Nations or others, you can certainly have multilateral organizations and membership groups declaring terrorist organizations, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, those are good examples. But, again, at the national level, there is really some divergence there. I would say that the conditions that you highlight in your question, such as, corruption, or absence of rule of law. I find these both symptomatic and contributory to state failure, or at least to fragility, as we discussed in your first question. And here, such as in Afghanistan, again, power and authority are contested. So at the moment, the government of Afghanistan is the recognized authority of the state, right? But clearly, that doesn't mean that it's seen uniformly as legitimate by its people, right? The government of Afghanistan, really, if you look at their role as a governance structure, it's really struggled hard to deliver on good governance promises. And that's created an opening for comparison with the Taliban's rule. I mean, so you're hearing me echo the same thing I said to you about Mali a couple of minutes ago. So there's a question of the governance rule, and then there's a question about, are there alternate governance models going forward? Really, it has to be, and it is, an issue of perception and an issue of delivery. And because of Afghanistan's fragility, it also creates these opportunities, as we talked about before, other armed actors to operate. I mean, so of course you got the Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, but you also have the associates, the Islamic Jihad Union, and Jund al-Khalifa, or the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. The list goes on and on. But if you open the newspaper today, you'll see that dynamics are changing as a result of changes by the U.S. February 2020, just last year, agreement between the United States and the Taliban, it already, for all of us paying attention, it signaled a posture change on the terrorist label. And that posture change was an attempt, to limit the national threat against the United States by having the Taliban agree not to target U.S. interests or U.S. forces, and to break its relationship with Al-Qaeda. The U.S. doesn't negotiate with terrorists. How many times have we heard that expression? Unless they're no longer labeled as terrorists, right? Then because they're no longer a threat to our interests. I mean, that is realpolitik at its best, right? And this is the world of negotiation, where you move by what's pragmatic at the moment, and you believe is going to accomplish your needs. But I would say, and not surprisingly, that adherence to those conditions in that February agreement are really questionable. And with the current U.S. administration announcing a full withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan by September 11th, that the leverage on the Taliban is really all but eliminated. Mm-hmm. So the Afghan government undoubtedly will have its hands full in an effort to remain in power in the medium term. So, Karina, I think we're likely looking at a scenario where the Taliban makes substantial progress against the government in the near and medium term. And if Afghanistan comes under Taliban control, whether it's through force or it's compromise or electoral processes or however that comes about, then the tables would turn, with the former terrorist becoming the government, right? So the need for acquiring legitimacy, or conversely, instituting, a brutal subjugation, if it had to come to that, to maintain control, that would then fall to the Taliban. It'd be their responsibility. But you mentioned one other thing which I want to touch on just very briefly. You talked about development assistance, and regardless of who is in power, I see a continued need for foreign development assistance until Afghanistan really shifts its illicit and its informal economy into a taxable, regulated, formal economy. And certainly if there is peace, and we all hope for peace in Afghanistan, the peace dividend is more easily facilitated if you have adequate resources. The problem is, from the circles that I'm traveling in, the appetite for supporting Afghanistan with development assistance is really waning, and particularly, in light of the COVID response, in light of other international and national priorities. So, the interest on supporting big development initiatives in Afghanistan are not quite there like they were a few years ago.
Thank you, Dr. Farrell, for wow, that was an incredible response. And this leads me to the final question about the lone wolf attacks in the United States, where we see them increasing day by day, rather than balancing what is the bigger threat, jihadi or neo-Nazi movements. Do you see common denominators in the profiles of the perpetrators?
You know, much of our attention, if you think about researchers and those of us working in this space, it's been focused on group-based participation in terrorism. We think about, it comes to your mind about the thousands of people who joined ISIS in Iraq and Syria from around the globe. Or you might even think about the people in this opaque landscape of white supremacist organizations. Research of terrorist organizations has shown us, however, that there really is no pathway to these organizations, no set pathway. There are pathways, multiple pathways, but there's no set pathway to these organizations, and no consistent profile of terrorists. There's a variety of ethnicities, a variety of religions, a variety of wealth profiles. Again, this is in group-based terrorism. But you raise a question, I think an important question, about lone wolves or independent actors, and specifically in the United States. Overall, I can say that lone wolf attacks, while increasingly in the media and therefore on all of our minds, it's still not highly common. If you think about, or if you look at research that's been conducted, the Department of Justice funded a research study that identified, a little over 100 cases of lone wolf terrorism since the 1940s. And then there was a similar study that came out about a year and a half ago from the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation in the United States, citing more than 50 attacks since the 1970s that were external to organizations. So again, fitting that description of lone wolves. And in the FBI research, they said, again, like the group-based research, it's not possible to identify a common profile of lone wolves. But interestingly, they had some elements that I think are worth paying attention to. So they did find that a high number of these lone wolves had previously exhibited some sort of aggressive behavior. They had prominent personal grievances and life stressors. And then most of them had produced some sort of manifesto or written piece that they intended people to see. A majority of these had been arrested at some point in time before their lone wolf attack. And then one of the other interesting things is every single one of those people in this FBI study somebody had noticed something changing about those people in advance of the attack. So there was something visible, a visible manifestation of their change in behavior that took place prior to the attack. And those are interesting nuggets of information. And then they layer on top of that paranoia and suicidal ideation. These were higher among this particular group of lone wolves than among the general population. That caught my attention because it tracks with research that I've seen out of the UK from Cormer and Gill that also found that lone wolves had a higher prevalence of mental illness in the sample that they were looking at in their particular research than the general population, or than group-based terrorism. So these, again, not definitive, but it's telling us something interesting. In particular, one of those authors, Gill, also went on to look at further research where he said, the behavior of lone wolves is more like murderers, perhaps, than like transnational terrorists, particularly jihadists. The other thing we know from the data sets that are out there is that lone wolf attacks have predominantly been carried out by single males with an average age in the mid-30s. So that's interesting because it's older, somewhat older than the transnational terrorists, and particularly the jihadists. I think as far as elements that are of value to pay attention to, those are ones I would look at. I think all of these, raise questions of how similar are the behaviors of the lone wolves versus the behaviors of group-oriented terrorists. I mean, so there's some theory that at-risk people are exploring and searching for information, and they're curious, and so they reach out to people or they look online. Dr. Pittman, I'm sure, has more information about the online than I do, and then they're either passively identified by recruiters or facilitators, and they proactively seek out a way to be involved in a group setting or perhaps as inspired individuals. And then some of these, obviously elevate to violent behavior. The piece that I see in my own research and I see in other people's research is this tying between the head and the heart in narratives. So narratives help people to feed into the emotional appeal and the clear and compelling and rational arguments that are often based in kind of a kernel of fact, but are modified in a way to compel people to be involved. So, things like, fellow Muslims in Syria are suffering at the hands of an oppressive leader, or our country's being stolen by corrupt elites in the deep state. I mean, those kind of narratives, really get to people's mind and heart simultaneously. I say all of this with the idea too that there are a variety of motivations for why people get involved in group-based violent extremism, terrorism, with push and pull factors, what attracts people into groups or what pushes them away from what they see as oppressive or unjust societies. But for lone wolves, it's not yet fully clear if they follow this same radicalization pattern and this same behavior. I mean, the final research that I'd cite, which I think is also interesting, is this work by Macaulay and Moskalenko from a couple of years ago. And in their research of lone wolves, they found that there were two different clusters. They found one cluster where lone wolves are these socially disconnected individuals, stressed with a psychological disorder and with a grievance. Maybe they have some weapons experience. And then there's a second cluster of individuals that feel a strong personal obligation to reduce the suffering of others, or to revenge their suffering. So I mean, those two buckets. But again, not definitive research at this stage. Still, I'd say in the early stages of figuring out what lone wolves look like and how they behave overall.
Thank you, Dr. Farrell. We hope to see more research done on this particular topic, because it's important to understand what drives people in joining those kind of movements, either neo-Nazi movement or jihadi movement. Thank you very much, Dr. Farrell.